Cool, thank you. So, hello everyone. I want to talk to you today about a kind of personal project of mine called Linux on Android, and what I went through to try and revive it after 10 years of kind of not actually doing anything on the project. So, before we get started, a quick kind of who am I, just to help everyone kind of understand where I'm coming from. So I am a developer relations manager at Vonage. I manage the client SDK team and all things to do with clients, so iOS, Android, and JavaScript on the web. However, in my kind of wider world, I've been an Android developer for over 12 years. I started in 2009 and kind of always had a really big interest in Android and all things Android, whether it's building Android applications, whether it's tinkering with the OS itself, and everything in between. That's very much been where I have had personal interest and lots of hobby projects and all that sort of stuff. So I was the lead developer on the Linux on Android project, and that's kind of the project that we're going to talk about today. I want to go through, I guess, kind of some of the lessons that I learned when I went back to this project and kind of the pains and suffering that I dealt with when I thought, you know what would be a great idea? Let's try and bring back a project that was 10 years old. And by doing that, kind of got 4 lessons that I think hopefully will really help you make sure that your projects are more future-proof than mine was. And kind of had the goal of, well, if I come back to this thing in 10 years' time, can we still use it? Can it still work? And hopefully, once we've been through this journey, the answer will be yes. So we'll take a look and we'll see what we can do. But I think if I'm going to talk about this project, I'm going to talk about what I've done more recently with this project. We should really go all the way back to the beginning, where it all started. And for me personally, it all started with the HTC Magic. I believe it's the T-Mobile MyTouch 3G, a name that really rolls off the tongue in the US, and it might have had other names around the world. But for me, this was my first Android device. This was the first time I'd used any smartphone personally, and it really kind of opened me into this new world. At the time, I was a university student. I was learning to program. I was learning kind of what it is to be a software developer. And for me, this is what really changed things, because I was kind of focused on a Java developer before I had come across Android. And so when I found Android, it dawned on me that I can build mobile applications using Java. I can take the skills that I've already learned and I can actually do something cool on my own device, on my own phone, and pretty easily distribute that to other people as well. It opened me to this whole new community. And it's that community that really got me into tinkering with Android. I was already a bit of a Linux fan anyway, so the fact that this device also had a Linux kernel and was open source really spoke to me and really got me interested in the mobile world. And that's kind of what led me towards Linux on Android. So what was or is Linux on Android? And this is a project that I had started quite early on into my time as a developer, really. And I kind of had seen this as an idea previously. It might have been a blog post, I forget, it was a long time ago. But the idea was basically to run a full GNU Linux distribution on your Android device. They shared the same kernel. So in theory, you had the building blocks that you needed to make this happen. And you could do this using a piece of software called chroot, which, as the name kind of abbreviates, it allowed you to change the root directory of your device, to point the kernel to a different root directory and have a whole separate environment that you could run software within. This was actually the same situation with Chromebooks. If anyone kind of remembers the early days of Chromebooks and getting Linux running on those, it was used the same method. pointing the kernel of the device to a new root file system, and then running executable code from there. So this was the idea that kind of existed, and you could do this either through ADB, or you could use a terminal emulator to get things going and build up your environment and all that sort of stuff. You could actually also get a GUI running by using something like VNC to create a virtual desktop, which was quite cool as well. So it meant you could have a full desktop experience with desktop applications running on your device. And what was really great about this kind of method was that it didn't touch Android. It didn't change anything about the Android operating system, because all you were doing is creating a separate file system somewhere, probably on an SD card or something like that, and then pointing the kernel to that situation, to that directory. There was nothing changing about Android, other than one key point, which was it did require root at the time. So yes, Android had to be modified to get to this point, but once you had root, once you were doing that, nothing else had to change. And at the time, at least, there was a huge community around rooting devices and getting extra features out of the device and all these sorts of things. And Android was still quite young, so there was lots of things that you could do with a rooted device that you couldn't do with normal Android. And also, app developers hadn't really started cutting back on what you can do once you've rooted. There didn't really exist frameworks to like detect if a device was rooted or anything like that. So things like banking apps and that sort of stuff still worked. Whereas today, if your device is rooted, a lot of apps just won't work, which I think is a shame personally, but I can understand where they're coming from. So it did require root, but at the time that wasn't such a big, strange, scary thing. So how did we get started with this project? Like I said, I kind of had the idea through like blog posts and reading about this whole kind of idea around root. So as with most projects at the time, it started with me just hacking about on my device. I'd rooted my device already. I'm pretty sure I was running CygenMod, if anyone remembers that. And I was kind of seeing what I could do. And this is where I started tinkering with my own kind of scripts using ADB to launch commands, getting everything running. And in the end, we had a guide on XDA, which of course was the place that everyone went to if you wanted to tinker with Android. So we have a screenshot here of the main post of this XDA guide. I don't remember, this is going to be circa like 2011. The original post was in 2009, but this would have been edited and built on top of it. And as you can see, there's Ubuntu 10.10 images. So I'm imagining it was around 2011 that the screenshot came from. I can't remember, but it was a while ago. And all it really was at the time was a command line script that you could run over ADB and a pre-configured image of Ubuntu that you could then mount, and that would be your root file system. That was all it really was. There's these two separate components, and it was very technical, and you kind of needed to know what you were doing. But there was a lot of interest. People really loved the idea of being able to run Linux code on their device. You could do silly things like run a web server. You could run a file server. You could actually, using VNC, run like LibreOffice or GIMP or whatever you might want to do, your image manipulation software. So there was a lot of things that you could do, and that really excited people. So from that guide, we realized that actually, yeah, lots of people are very interested in this. So let's build an app. And this kind of progressed into the first version of the app. There's a screenshot here in all its glory, using that kind of very ancient dashboard UI that at the time was very popular and is seen as a great way to display lots of information on your home page. And what this app really did was just integrate the guides into one place. It was still just text guides that then provided you links to download the files you needed, but there was no automation or anything like that. But what it did do is really get the idea out to more people. Suddenly, it wasn't just people that read XDA, or people even that were reading the specific forums in XDA. There was a lot going on that website. There's not to say that you would come across my thread. So this app really helped push us out into the wider world and get more interest. So from here, it definitely sparked this idea of, okay, actually, this is a real project that can really go somewhere. And at the time, we had a free version of the app, and then we had a paid version of the app. And the paid version was really just there to help support the project. Didn't actually really do anything more. There wasn't anything more to do. But as you can probably see from the screenshot, this was back in the days of Android Market, if anyone remembers that, as opposed to the Play Store. So this is where we realized that, yeah, this is something we're going to keep up. This is something that's going to be big. We should keep going with this. And so the app went through lots of revisions, lots of improvements. We continued to update the app. We continued to automate more of the process to make it easier for people to actually do this and get Linux running on their device. Importantly, of course, as well, with this screenshot, you'll see we got rid of the dashboard. No more dashboard UI. It was all about those high-tech slide-out menus, those swish animations and everything else that came in that kind of era of like circa 2012 Android development. So we moved away from the old UI, new UI, and more automation, more ways to kind of just press this button and we'll download, extract, set up, and that kind of steps. And it continued to be more and more successful. It didn't stop. It was great. We were inundated with interest. People wanted to start helping contribute to the project. People wanted to help translate the guides into other languages and all those sorts of things. So, as was the time in 2013, we decided to launch a Kickstarter. Everyone was doing it. It was the cool thing to do. And it was quite a successful Kickstarter. We managed to raise the money that we needed to, which meant that I was able to kind of focus on the project in a more full-time capacity. I was still studying at university, possibly just graduated, but it was around that time where I just needed to be generating some money to keep things going. I wasn't just living on my student loans anymore. So the Kickstarter enabled that to happen, and we had a couple of other developers getting involved as well on a part-time basis. And that was just like a real peak time at the project. And because of that extra time, because of that ability to focus on this, we released more updates and we improved it even further. As you can see, we kept with the slide out menu, but we enhanced it and we added more detail and we added more automation to the application itself so that you could kind of install Linux in a more automated, like stable process, or you could go down the manual route if you really wanted to tinker. We also removed the paid version. Those like having a separate paid app kind of fell out of fashion. And instead we focused on having adverts within the app and then an in-app purchase to remove those adverts. And that's really all we offered. It was simply a way for people to support the project. You didn't have to do it if you were happy to just be served the adverts. We also open sourced the project at this point. Parts of it were already open source. Things like the build scripts and the launch scripts already existed as open source, just script files on XDA. But now we open sourced the full application. So people could get involved, they could contribute, they could do all those sorts of fun things. And that was really, really successful. At the kind of peak of the project, I would say 2014, we had over 1 million downloads. We had over 100,000, active installs. And we were also featured in the Linux Format magazine, which I have a photo of here. And they did a great article on how you can use our application to set up Linux and all the fun things that you can do with that. So that was really cool. Like to have my application in physical print in an actual magazine was mind-blowing to me. But then life kind of happened, got in the way. I was offered a job for an Australian company who were developing a tablet that was going to run Android, and then when it was docked, it would run Linux on a monitor. So this meant that basically they were using the technologies that we had kind of enhanced, improved, developed over the years, and they fully supported me in kind of doing that. And they did allow me, they wanted me to continue working on the open source side on the Linux on Android project. But at the same time, I did have kind of deadlines and things that I had to do for this company. So my time focused on the open source side started to diminish. I also started freelancing as an Android developer. I needed to kind of keep a revenue stream coming. I wasn't entirely sure of the longevity of this project. So I started working as a freelance Android developer outside of this, building other apps, doing other things like that. I also got married. And what that meant really is that a combination of all these things, my focus, my priorities changed, and there was no real time left for Linux on Android. I wanted to spend time with my wife. I wanted to spend time working on projects that were paying me money. All these sorts of things kind of just meant that the Linux on Android project got put on the back burner. The two other kind of main developers of the project as well were both at university throughout a lot of this time. They'd graduated and they went off to do other things and get jobs and have lives. So the kind of fuel behind the project really dropped off quite quickly. And there isn't really anyone there left to maintain it. So if we fast forward now to about 2021, 2022, last year, I was kind of just perusing my Play Store developer account. I hadn't logged in a very long time. And I thought, is anyone still using that project? I'd never taken it down. It was still downloadable. Did it even still work? I genuinely had no idea. What I did find, of course, is that the ratings and the reviews of the app had steadily declined because, unfortunately, a lot of it didn't work anymore. It didn't keep, it hadn't been updated in many years. There was lots of changes to Android. Things didn't really work as they used to. So there was definitely like that negativity around it. But what I did see is that from the statistics, there were still over 10,000 people that had an active install of the app on their device. And this really struck me as crazy. Like, this app that I hadn't done an update on for years still had people using it, still had people wanting it to work. The versions of Linux that you could download, Ubuntu and what have you, they were old, they were outdated, they barely functioned. But I guess there was enough people that just wanted the idea to function. So they still had it installed. And that meant a lot to me. That was crazy. So I thought, right, it's time to get back to work. It's time that we see if we can revive this project. What's it actually going to take to make this work in modern times with modern Android? So I did a bit of research, did a bit of kind of looking about different components of the app that I knew would be required and how they worked in modern versions of Android. And I stumbled across this thing called proot. And what this allowed you to do is run certain applications as if they were running under a root user. And this was exactly perfect for my needs for root. We could fake the permissions that we needed to point the kernel to a new mount point and get Linux running without root. We never modified anything on Android. We never actually edited any files. We never did anything that you would like traditionally need root for. So it was always kind of a stumbling block that it needed root, and it was great to see there was a new way around this. So that gave me a new kind of refresh on it. Well, hang on a minute. I could now make it in a way that anyone can have access. Anyone can run Linux. So I thought, let's have a look and let's see if we can find the code base. That was the first thing. Did I still have the code for this app, for the scripts, for everything around it? So it's time to dust off the code. Now, like I previously mentioned, a lot of the stuff had been hosted on SourceForge. And SourceForge has kind of declined quite considerably in popularity. But thankfully, there was actually a mirror of the code bases on GitHub. So I did actually still have access to the code, which is, tick one, a great start to what we need to do. But what I realized is Android had come an awfully long way from the days of when this was built. Obviously, the biggest being that back then, the language you would use was Java, and now very much the language, at least I use, is Kotlin. It's been a very long time since I've exclusively written in Java. I'm definitely a Kotlin developer. So that was an instant thing of like, oh God, yeah, how did I make this? How did I do this with this language? There was also a slight issue in that I had no idea where the key store was anymore that was used to sign the application. So was I even going to be able to make a release without, or was I going to have to make a whole new app and a whole new app on the App Store? Now, considering the reviews and how negatively it come down, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was still frustrating and still a thing that I had to kind of consider, like, am I going to reuse this project or am I going to have to start completely fresh? Where do we go from here? The other thing, of course, is I started looking through the code. This is actually a screenshot of one of the activity classes. And I don't know if this was me, someone else working on the project, if I'd just gone kind of lost my mind for a while, but someone thought it was a great idea to try and tab align the variable names and the variable values. And I can safely tell you that this is never a good idea. This was never a good idea even back then. And I don't really know why it was done, but kind of speaks volumes to the readability of this code. It was a mess. So I kind of like to include this in here so that you can all laugh at me, because I'm pretty certain this was my own code. And at some point in my life, I thought this was a vaguely good thing. So feel free to point and laugh. So I've kind of examined, at this point, I've examined the source code and gone, yeah, it's going to need pretty much a rewrite. I'm not sure yet whether I'm going to do it as an update or as a separate app, but it's going to need a rewrite. But then I started thinking about all the other components that make an open source project. One of these was websites and hosting. One of the components of this whole project was the image files of the actual Linux root image. And those were kind of, we took the built images from the likes of Ubuntu and then applied some of our own configuration and changes to make a usable image just out of the box. So we hosted those and you could download them. But I had no idea where those were hosted anymore. In fact, I'm sure I certainly wasn't paying for the hosting anymore. So they were long gone. And the website itself, it was just using some random host provider of the time, probably whichever was cheapest, probably whichever was easiest for me to use. And of course, it was also using WordPress, which for anyone that's used WordPress will know that it's very slow and very resource expensive. It uses a lot of power just to render the page. Everything was being rendered in real time. Nothing was static. It was a mess. And sure, I had the source code of this website, but it was a WordPress setup and a very old one at that. So it didn't really work. So I knew I was going to have to rebuild a website, do something new. It was always kind of this thing where really I just needed a static website. And in the days of now with cloud computing, I've used AWS for a lot of things. I knew that I could do that at basically free. And then I could even use an S3 bucket for any of the file hosting I needed. So these things kind of have come a long way. And it wasn't the biggest issue, but it was definitely something I had to consider. And then, of course, like I kind of mentioned before, the actual source code, the actual stuff that made up this project, it was all on SourceForge. Now, I don't know if I'm aging myself here, but once upon a time, SourceForge was amazing. Once upon a time, SourceForge was the place to go. And then they decided to cover it in adverts and everybody left. and everybody went to GitHub. So I knew that, yeah, there was no way I was actually going to be hosting this on SourceForge anymore. We definitely needed to move our repositories to GitHub. Again, a small detail really in the grand scheme of things, but something that had to be considered, had to set up the correct kind of GitHub configuration and think about these sorts of things and try and recover as much of the source code as I could. So I could at least decide on what I was going to keep and what was going to be brand new. And then there was communications. So when we were building the project and talking, it started out on XDA, like I said, in a forum. But the forum kind of became too fast moving. For anyone that's used forums, it can be very easy to get lost in a thread, and trying to keep up with it can be very difficult. So we thought, well, we need to use real-time chat for something. So we thought, let's go and set up an IRC channel. And let's do that on Freenode, because Freenode was the place to be at the time. Now, again, some of you might know that Freenode is no longer the place to be, and there's been a lot of issues there. And suffice to say, even if those communication channels still exist, I do not have the login details for them, nor would I want to use them. I would not want to touch Freenode with a barge pole. So that kind of aspect of the project was very much dead and would need to be restarted. And also, of course, unfortunately, I lost communication with the developers and all those volunteers and all those people that made up the community. They were all gone, scattered throughout the winds. So needless to say, when I'd kind of gone through all of this, this was kind of my general reaction. I was looking back at the code, the website, the source code, the communications, everything, and just kind of screaming internally, thinking maybe I really shouldn't have wanted to restart this project. Maybe it was a bad idea. And sure, it probably wasn't a project manager standing next to me. It's probably my wife going, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you screaming?" But needless to say, it was not a good place. But what it has allowed me to do is come up with some lessons that hopefully you'll be able to take away, and you'll be able to not have to do these things and not feel the pain that I felt. Well, that's the goal here. So I have 4 lessons for you that hopefully will help you make sure that your project stays usable and kind of easier to work on in 10 years' time. If you get to a point where you want to restart a project, or actually maybe it will allow you to keep your project going for 10 years. That's the goal, really. Now, the first one is going to be architecture. I would definitely say it is vital to develop an app's architecture very early on in the process. As soon as you kind of understand what you want your app to do, you need to start thinking about the architecture. You need to think about how you're actually going to build this thing. And I would say that, I didn't give this enough thought. This app was definitely cobbled together over years. There was no real consistency. And once you've settled on an architecture, and there are many different ones out there, and they all probably have very valid use cases. So there's not to say there's a wrong architecture, but the importance is that you enforce the architecture, particularly when you're working on an open source project. Make sure everyone involved understands the architecture and commits to it. Because otherwise, as soon as you start letting random clothes slip in because, whoever wants to help you and wants to build a feature, but he doesn't actually follow the architecture, or she thinks they can do it in a better way, make sure you're enforcing it, because otherwise you're going to end up with a big mess. And on that kind of idea, make sure you're maintaining documentation. Make it easy for developers to contribute by explaining to them how to contribute. How is your app designed? How are different components working together? What are the areas that you need help with? This would have really helped me, because had I documented what I'd done, the 10 years later, when I came to look at the project again, the documentation would have been a great place to start to read and re-understand my thought process at the time, to understand why I did the things I did, because there were probably perfectly good reasons for most of the things I did, but I don't know what those were anymore. So the documentation is so vital, because not only in the moment when you're trying to get more people to help you, but in the future. And this remains true even for if you're a single developer working on a project. Document your thought processes, even if it's just a README file that's 10,000 words that just describes everything. It's fine. Have it written down, though, so that you can go back to it if you need to. So my kind of lesson number 2, third parties. It kind of encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about. No single platform will ever stay on top forever. SourceForge, amazing. Oh, look, GitHub's better. Freenode, amazing. Oh, look, other IRC suppliers are better. Had we not been using IRC, I would have probably at the time used Skype, because it was one of the best communication tools available. That's clearly not the case anymore. Something like Discord or Slack would be better. My point is, there's never going to be a safety net where there's just one platform and you can put all your eggs in one basket and it'll be there forever. Sure, some things are going to be more likely to hang around. AWS isn't going anywhere soon. Is it going to be there in 20 years' time? I don't know. Certainly not going to look the same as it does now. So always have a backup plan. I'm reliant on this service or this other company. What do I do if that goes down? What do I do if that company closes? Have that in your mind as just a backup plan. Even you don't have to implement anything, just know what you would do in those situations. And on the same kind of lines, talking about third parties, when we're focusing more about code, really think about the dependencies that your app uses. Something that I was kind of fell foul to was the idea of, oh, well, yeah, I could write this class, but someone else has already done it for me, so I'm going to use that dependency. And if you do that for every component in your application, your dependency list might be 200 dependencies long. If you try and go back to your application in 10 years' time, how many of those dependencies are still going to be around? How many of those dependencies are going to look anything like the version that you used? The likelihood is very, very few, if any. Really consider each dependency that you use. Yes, that one helper class might be super useful right now, but if that person no longer maintains that helper class, are you still going to have to support it? Is it better to just write the class that specifically does the thing you need right now? In some situations, you can't avoid dependencies. There are some things that actually, there's a lot of work that goes into them. They're well maintained, and they are going to make the development process massively easier. But really consider what you're putting into your application, because some things might seem like a small little thing right now, but actually they could be the biggest headache of your life in a few years' time. Not even 10 years, just a few years' time. Android makes some changes. It that plugin, that dependency breaks your application. That developer no longer supports it. You have to rewrite everything. Think about it. I cannot recommend that enough. And my third kind of trial by fire, shall we say, is that Android moves very quickly. And not just Android, Kotlin as well. A lot has changed in the last 10 years of Android development. We have had every sort of change imaginable, from literally changing to a different programming language, to changing how we do UI, to changing how we do theming, styling, user experience. All these things have evolved massively. But it's important to remember that you don't need every bell and whistle. What is your application actually doing? What does it need that's going to give it the best user experience for your users? Because features, APIs, SDKs, styles, theming, UI, best practices in general, they all change. And I kind of fell a little bit foul to that in the earlier days, where we had this dashboard UI and then no, that's not popular anymore, so we're going to move to a sidebar UI. Oh, that's not really so popular, so we're going to upgrade it to a better one. Maybe we need to use a banner, or whatever. There are loads of these like UI elements that come into fashion and leave fashion. So consider what UI and user experience you actually need for your app. If it's a utility app, if it's something like Linux on Android, which really is just there to help the user do something else, it doesn't really need the most shiny experience UI. It just needs a clean, concise experience that makes it easy for developers, for users to use the app. So really consider what you do and don't want to include in your app, because the new shiny thing today, next year may no longer be supported, may no longer be the way to do it. So sometimes it's better to be conservative on these things. But again, it really depends on your app. If your app is very UI driven, very all about like the clean, amazing animations, then yeah, obviously you're going to do these things. But if it's more of a utility thing, it's probably not worth it. And then finally, communication. As I mentioned before, we had massive issues with communication. I still haven't got into contact with most of the people that worked on the project or were involved in the community. I've got no idea where they are. Whatever you do, even if you no longer have time to work on a project, try and keep those channels of communication open. Make it easy for others to help. The project might have continued on if there was documentation and it was clear what could be done and what needed to be done in the app. People might have jumped in and helped. And I may have only just had to kind of become the project manager, not actually write any code. And that might have meant that I could have continued the project for years and years and years, and we would be in a very different situation now. But because I didn't keep those communication channels open, I didn't write documentation, that wasn't possible. And it's also important to remember that even communication channels, they change. IRC, Freenode, it's gone away. We might have used Skype in the past. Well, now it would be Discord or Slack. And in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows what will be the communication platform of choice. But there's one communication method on the internet that has been around forever and isn't going anywhere, and that's email. Sometimes just having a simple mailing list is possibly the best way to keep in communication. No matter what happens, as a fallback, it is brilliant. Sure, for live chat and live communication, it doesn't work. You're going to need to have something else to foster the community. But if you just want to be able to keep in contact with people, please, please, please have a mailing list, get people's email addresses that want to be involved, and keep that communication going. Because that way, when you go to do work on the project 10 years later, you can talk to people and you can find other people to help you, and you don't have to be like me pulling my hair out. So those are my 4 kind of suggestions to you. I really hope that helps in some way when you're next working on a project and you're thinking about the longevity of it. I really hope that gives you some good advice. And I will say, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for having me. You'll be able to find me on my Polywork profile for all the different talks and stuff that I do. You can also go check out my GitHub, where I have this talk on there and all my other active talks at the moment. So please do check that out. And the QR code should also take you to my Polywork profile. So thank you very much. And I hope you've enjoyed my talk.
Thank you, Zachary. That was an amazing talk and great set of advices. Also, it's been a while since I've heard of XD as well. And I remember how back in the day, XD was a crucial part of Android development in terms of custom ROMs, kernels, or projects like Linux on Android. And once I looked at the project now, at the presentation, I realized that I actually tried using it when it was very active. So
excellent.
It just struck me once I saw that XD page.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Well, it's always good to hear from people that gave it a go. Excellent.
We don't have any questions. In case anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them. Meanwhile, I do have a question.
Okay.
When I hear about some project like Linux on Android, it seems like a very daunting task to be able to run a Linux distro on your phone. So when you actually started it, like, what did you think? Like, how did you tackle that problem that you wanted to do something that big without being similar projects out there that did the same thing?
Lots of trial and error, lots of swearing, and lots of sweat. No, it really was a very slow process. I think that's the thing. Like when I look at it now, it's this massive thing, but it really did take maybe months before I actually had something working on just on my phone. And then it was like, okay, well, how can I reproduce that? So there was definitely some kind of background knowledge that I'd tinkered with Linux in the past, but it wasn't kind of an overnight thing. And I think what's great is trying to break a project down into very small parts. So like the first thing was like, well, okay, where am I going to store the file system? How am I going to mount that? And then, you kind of build it up from there and there and there. And it was just a lot of trial and error.
Yeah, that's actually really good advice. And I feel that it also translates to other sort of such big projects as well.
Yeah, definitely.
We do have a few questions. So we have one by Ryan. What was the interoperability like for working with the GUI in Linux on the phone?
Yeah, so it definitely wasn't the best experience because, for one, there was no hardware acceleration for the UI, so things were very slow. You certainly couldn't play video smoothly, but it was always more of a look, you can do this. Anyone that was actually using it was doing it from the command line, because there you could actually run a process on the CPU and make full use of the power. So that was always more of the kind of flashy, oh, look how cool this is. There wasn't very many actual good use cases. I guess the biggest being things like being able to use LibreOffice. In the real early days, there weren't very good Office applications for Android. So being able to use something a bit more full featured to read a document or something, yeah, that kind of worked well. But yeah, mainly it was just a because you could situation.
On to the next question. I'm not sure if you could use the IME keyboard, for example. I'm assuming that's specific to the Android OS and wouldn't be available, but not sure.
Yeah, so because you were basically connecting to this virtual desktop through a VNC client on the Android device, you could use the Android keyboard and kind of use the touchscreen as a mouse device and move it around like you would a trackpad. Or you could actually connect to it via another computer. Anything that has a VNC client, you could do that. So it would be like your remote desktoping into another computer. So it was definitely functional. It just, I'm not really sure how many good use cases there were.
We have one final question. How would you consider maintaining backward compatibility in a long-lived open source project?
Yeah, so I mean, backwards compatibility is always a tough one, especially with something like Android. But it does go back to things like picking your dependencies and not being drawn in by the flashy new things. A lot of these flashy new things will have a much more modern required API level, and a lot of dependencies only support X amount of API levels. So really being careful about that and trying to stick to the core Android APIs will really help you in that. That was quite easy for me because realistically, the application didn't have to do much. And I understand, of course, that in a more complex applications that were doing more on the Android side, you'll probably find that you reach a point you have to bump the compatibility version up somewhat. I mean, Google's doing a lot to try and make it easier for people to upgrade, make devices last longer. And it was certainly worse back then. It was kind of like, well, here's the version of Android you have installed on your device. That's it. Good luck. So back then, it was definitely more about trying to keep as much compatibility as possible. I think these days you can kind of be a bit more conservative and not have to support all the way back to Gingerbread or something. But that's kind of up to you and how much pain you want for yourself. Because trying to support those really old versions, I would say at this point, it's not worth it.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your great questions, and thanks Zachary for answering them.
No problem.